going to be easy to live with if you like to ride the bike park, and
it corners like nothing else I've really ridden before.
When Orbea launched their all-new Rallon DH bike earlier this year, their first ever downhill model, it created quite a buzz. It definitely helped that Tahnée Seagrave went out and won the first World Cup of the year on this bike. But I think a lot of riders saw what Orbea put out and really appreciated what they had created. They came up with a single frame design that could be set up as an enduro or downhill bike with a very active kinematics package and tall and low geometry. They also squeezed in frame storage, plenty of adjustability, and optional weights located at the bottom bracket. And they managed to wrap all of this into a tidy and sleek frame design. As one of the hottest new bikes on the circuit this year, we want to find out what makes the Rallon such a fast downhill bike and how that translates to day-to-day bike park riding. Riding Orbea's latest Rallon downhill bike first. We have a brand new test bike here, so I'm just doing a bolts check on it. But probably the most interesting thing about this bike to start with is it's also their enduro bike. It's the same frame between downhill and enduro. So as we're riding, it's 200 mils front and rear, dedicated mullet bike. You can get a different link to and a different shock to go to 170 paired with the 180 fork if you wanted to make this an enduro bike. Be curious to know how many riders actually do that, because you're looking at doing shock, link, fork. If you want full enduro mode, you're going dropper, drivetrain, but that option is there. Probably the most interesting aspect of this bike is you get these removable weights down below. I want to say it's just under 600 grams you can add on the downhill version with 3 different weights. I'm going to start with no weights. I'm going to take them off and ride the bike and then add them to comment on how that feels. So the Rallon uses a linkage driven single pivot suspension design with a concentric pivot at the rear axle. What's the most interesting aspect of its kinematics is it's got really low anti-squat to reduce the effects of the chain on the suspension, which should make it feel nice and ground hugging, but also improve how the bike feels under braking. So that'll be interesting to see how it goes. Some other little details here with like the shock itself is Orbea did a lot of testing with Martin Mays when they were developing this bike. I'm sure a lot of people saw him riding a version of their Wild e-bike, and a lot of that was to figure out weight distribution on the bike, but also getting that weight down low. So that's like why we see the shock mounted so low in this bike, which is pretty compelling and interesting. I would say the one downside is, at least with the Float X2 air shock that this bike comes with, you can't reach the rebound knobs. You have to drop that biggest weight to actually get to there. So that will be one pro as I set this up, is starting with no weight. I can get my rebound set where I want. Also, I think it's easy to look at this bike and just question how much dirt and water will get to where that shock is sitting in the frame, especially when the guard is installed. But there is a port out the back for water and stuff to drain. It's dry here. Where we're testing in Whistler, we're not gonna have a chance to test that. Maybe I'll wash it once or twice just to kind of see if water does come out of there. Otherwise, this frame, as I led with in the intro, is crazy sleek. Like, this top tube is so thin. I would say just walking through the village, it has gotten the most looks. So from a standpoint of you're spending a lot of money on a bike, this thing definitely looks sick and it looks fast. One last little detail and adjustment you have is it does come with different headset cups to change the head angle by plus or minus 0.75 degrees, but we're just running it in the neutral position. The further in I go on this, the more complex it's sort of becoming. So to actually do the leverage rate change, you do have to remove the weight on the non-drive side to then flip this flip chip where the bolt's captured. So a little bit more involved. I would say that adding the side weights or removing them and changing the leverage rate flip chip is something you might only do every now and again, probably set and forget it. Mid-test check-in on the Orbea. It's been a bike that's taken me a little bit to get set up. It took the better half of the first day on it just to find my balance over it. I'm going to save that until we recap the bike to dive into that further. But it is a decently stiff bike, not in a bad way. It just has a lot of responsiveness to rider input. Be very intentional with your lines, but it does make for a bike that you can ride with a lot of intensity. Other than that, I would say this is a little bit smaller than I was expecting. I put it in the slacker headset position. So now we're sitting at a 475 reach. The bars are a little bit low for maybe what I would personally run, but the bike ride's low and tall. So the bars, even though they look crazy flat, it hasn't been as bad as I thought it was gonna be. Other than that, it's been a pretty good balance of handling the rough trails we've been riding, as well as being fun to ride on just your classic bike park flow berm trails. Cornering has been a standout, and I look forward to going into that more.
So I'm first run in on the Orbea, and I have a couple of thoughts. Right off the bat, it corners like nothing else I've really ridden before. It's really easy to corner, and it's really, really stable, especially in berms. The other thing is the rear suspension feels very smooth. The rear wheel moves out of the way of bumps very easily. I'm having a tough time getting the fork to match the rear. The fork feels a little stiff. I am at the recommended pressure for the fork for my body weight. So I'm gonna play around, probably firm up the rear a little bit, take some tokens out of the front, and we'll see how she goes.
Starting with just the geometry of this bike, when I first got on it, it was a little bit short on reach, a little bit low front end, matched with the rear end felt a little bit on the shorter side, and the bottom bracket was quite low. That created a few different sensations. With the BB being low, and I would say the rear end being a little bit short, I did feel quite rearward in some situations. And then when my weight was off the rear, it started to feel like the fork was a little bit too firm because I wouldn't have enough weight over the front end. And then in other situations, the front end felt too low and like my weight was transferring too much over the front. So I was kind of working with like contradicting feelings, trying to resolve that. To resolve all of that, I kind of picked the main priority of what I wanted to resolve, which was the sinking in the bike and feeling like I was too rearward. So I went with a little bit less sag, a little bit more pressure. I was around 25% sag instead of 30%, which they recommend. That helped me keep from feeling like I was sinking in the bike in some situations and my weight was transferring too far rearward. At the same time, I actually softened the front and lowered the fork in the crown to get the front end up a little bit, but also it felt like it got my weight more centered between the axles. I went to the progressive leverage rate position, and I also added all of the weight, and then I also took all the high-speed compression out of the shock. To me, that gave me the support I was looking for in the rear while allowing the rear wheel to get out of the way from bumps. And we went back and forth a little bit with the weight just when we first started. Once I got all those different adjustments tweaked, I did feel centered on this bike, even though the reach is a little bit shorter and the bar is a little bit lower than I would say bikes you and I would typically ride at being 6 foot tall. I wanted to kick this off because I had a longer process to get this bike set up and get that comfort, and then I kindly handed it off to you, and so your process getting comfort on this bike was a little bit different.
Yeah, so you did a lot of the work up front for me, and the first thing I noticed right off the bat was how well the rear end gobbled up terrain. It didn't blow through travel, but the wheel definitely moved out of the way, and I never really had any harsh bottom outs. I did bottom out, whatever, it's supposed to do that.
Yep.
But it was complemented by, in berms, it was very supportive and it pumped really well. So I thought the rear end was really well sorted. The one balance issue I ran into was I still thought the front end was a little too firm. Now, I was already at the recommended pressure for my weight of about 190 pounds. We had 3 tokens in the fork. And even looking back at the video, the front end was the biggest issue for me, where it was just too stiff. I wasn't using all the travel. I needed the fork to gobble up the terrain just as well as the rear did in order for the bike to feel balanced. And so what I did is I went down to 1 token and I kept dropping down a couple PSI until the whole bike felt balanced.
Let's move into talking about where the Rayon really stood out and was impressive. What were those to you?
Yeah, so the 2 things were really just the cornering feel was superb. You would like go into a corner, you had plenty of support, it felt really, really fast exiting the corner. And then I had this weird sensation, which was pretty consistent, that I could like pop out of the corner and almost like manual out of corners. And it didn't take any effort, but I didn't feel unstable.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I think this bike to me feels like it has such a low center of gravity. Probably part of it is the weights, as well as just where that lower length of shock mounts to is quite low in the bike. But it had the most impressive of maybe any bike I've really ever ridden, locking into like a line through a berm, and the ability to look up through it, feel your body weight weighting both axles nicely. And even though the rear end's not short, but it's not super long, so like at least on paper and with like the reach and everything, you kind of look at it like, this bike's a little compact, maybe it's gonna like snap around turns, and I could get it to do that. But at the same time, if I wanted to lock a line and just hold through a whole turn, it was really impressive. Adding on to just how much fun this bike was to turn, hitting jumps and stuff, it's super lively. You can ride this bike very intentionally, which on a jump trail to me just means that you can really influence where you put it, what you do in the air, hitting turns inside, all that good stuff.
Now let's touch on some things that maybe weren't perfect about the bike, especially being a downhill bike. What I noticed was the suspension moved out of the way really well. So I was quite comfortable going down the hill. I felt like I had decent traction, but it's not a very long bike. Now, does a downhill bike need to be huge? No, not necessarily, but I did feel like it was an enduro bike trying to be a downhill bike.
Yeah, I would say the main thing I struggled with on this bike is that for how ground hugging and smooth it was in really rough sections, there was other instances where I started to notice my weight transfer going forward and the wheel maybe struggling to get out of the way as well as I would have hoped it would. Quite a few sections we rode with really straight lines where you're braking really heavily, dropping into corners. I was having to slightly adjust the way I was riding to slow down. If I just kind of braked wherever I wanted to, I would notice the rear wheel starting to skip a little bit too much instead of absorbing those impacts, causing me to get more of the front. And then also somebody being who rides flat pedals, I have to ride with like my heels so dropped. As that weight transfer happens and my feet get a little bit flatter, I just don't become confident anymore. It wasn't like I couldn't ride the bike fast, but it did change my approach in those sections where I was a lot more on top of when I was braking. This bike has a slightly unique anti-rise, and that kind of helps explain what I was feeling.
Sure, so the bike has quite low anti-rise. Now, if you're coming into a section straight and it's not super bumpy, it's impressive how quickly the bike can slow down.
Yep.
Now, I think that's like a feature that Orbea even talks about on this bike. Like, it has really good braking. Now, I agree with that, but it is a bit of a balancing act to have really good braking. In that scenario, yes, but let's look at where maybe some of the compromise comes in when you have quite low anti-rise. Now, the first thing to know is that low anti-rise basically means that when you grab the brake, your rear wheel is sort of forcing itself towards the ground to grab for traction. It's pretty sweet, but when you're going into bumpy sections, in moments where you want your wheel to be moving out of the way, your wheel's trying to go into the bump. So what can happen is if you have too low of anti-rise, you start to hit a bump and your suspension sort of is fighting that bump, and the suspension's not compressing maybe as much as you want it to be, yet you expect it to. Losing braking traction by moving forward abruptly on the bike, but then additionally, it's almost like you're doing a push-up every single time you go into one of those rough corners, which makes it feel even rougher. So it does have good braking, just sometimes that good braking can lead to other issues.
Yep. Yeah, and that's, we've talked a lot about how I've said that like I struggled to feel like the rear wheel was getting out of the way, but at other moments, like this bike truly did just hold a line and like hug the ground really well, which it's tough because it's like, it wasn't necessarily bad everywhere in my mind, but it wasn't always super easy to predict when those moments would be. Yep. Instead of it, I'd prefer it to be consistent across the board, especially when it got steep. That was probably like the biggest differentiating factor is on flatter terrain, you're not locking up the rear wheel as much when you're slowing down. Your wheel rate's kind of continuing. The bike was working good. And then when I'd get into like those really dire moments where you're shutting it down, where I want my position on the bike, it just wasn't always, I couldn't maintain that, which was tough. If we own this thing for 6 months or a year, you obviously can work on things to get it the way you want to feel. And I have no doubt that you can't do that with this bike.
To add on to that, I'm coming off of bikes that do have decently low anti-rise, maybe not as low as this, but that sensation under braking is something that you know, that's how I've developed my muscle memory for how I brake into a bumpy corner.
Totally.
And so I rode it, I'm like, yeah, it feels like it brakes well, like it kind of teeter-totters, but that's the compromise you make.
Yeah.
Right? And that's like, oh yeah, this is what happens.
And I'm like, why aren't you feeling what I'm feeling?
yeah.
All right, moving on, let's touch on just some different frame things that stood out. I would say maybe the main thing for both of us that we noticed right away is this bike resonates a lot of sound. It's not the quietest. We did stuff some rags in the frame, which helped a little bit. I bet you could get a lot more creative than that and quiet this bike down. It's also worth touching on the fact that this is the only build that Orbea is offering, so you're going to be getting a Saint drivetrain, and I was not a huge fan. Turns out 14-year-old Saint derailleurs are louder than current, more newer drivetrains that have come out. What other details about this bike maybe stand out to you, good or bad?
Some other cool features on this bike is, I mean, the down tube storage, especially at a big bike park like Whistler, is kind of sweet. If you've ever gone a flat a third of the way down the mountain here, you'll be appreciative that you have a spare tube and a CO2. The lower shock mount, there's a lot going on in there. It definitely takes a minute to make any of the adjustments, even adjusting your rebound on this shock. And then the chainstay protection is pretty cool, but because we have this older derailleur, the chain whips all over the place, and it's definitely getting outside of the range of the chainstay protection and starting to chip the paint around it. On a modern derailleur, you probably won't have that issue, but it is something to consider on this older style of derailleur.
Closing this one out, why don't you give me your bottom line on Orbea's new Rayon?
I think it's a great bike. It's going to be easy to live with if you like to ride the bike park and race downhill. A lot of modern downhill bikes are getting so focused on optimizing for the gnarliest tracks that it can take away from your experience, especially at the bike park where they can get a little boring. This does a really good job at balancing fun and fast. What do you think?
I would agree with most of those points for sure. I do like some of the features you have with the weight, the storage, the water bottle cage, things that you're not used to seeing on a downhill bike, but you really can't appreciate if you, like you're talking about, you're just riding a bike park all the time, which is how I would see myself riding the Rayon the most. Ripping corners, hitting jumps, still going to those gnarlier tracks and feeling the comfort, feeling the stable I'm looking for. I think for me personally, this bike maybe didn't give me the ground hugging, like ultra plush feel I was after, but that's okay because there's other riders out there that are looking for that lively personality.
Yeah.